And for more insight on the progress made on the Gaza ceasefire deal, we have Simon Frankel-Pratt, Senior Lecturer of Political Science at the University of Melbourne, joining us live. Now, Dr. Pratt, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt have worked for more than a year to end the war in Gaza. And yesterday, they finally gave Israel and Hamas a final draft on a truce deal that they called a breakthrough to end the war in Gaza. Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, mentioned both sides seem to be coming to a closer agreement. Now, how promising does it seem at the moment?
It's hard to say. I always counsel optimism rather than pessimism. Certainly, there have been other ceasefire deals that have come very close and have been nixed either by Prime Minister Netanyahu or by Hamas. But things are different in this case, both because the war really seems to be kind of militarily stale. There's not really any further victory that Israel can win here. And Trump and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, are pressuring Netanyahu very hard. Now, Netanyahu's far-right coalition partners are certainly once again threatening to leave the government and bring it down should Israel agree to this ceasefire, but I don't think that's likely to happen in this case. So cautious optimism seems warranted.
I see. Now, what caused this, though? What caused this sudden breakthrough? Because President Joe Biden has pushed hard for a deal before he leaves office. And then we heard Donald Trump's inauguration is widely seen as a de facto deadline for the freeing of hostages. Between these two specific factors, do you think there was a specific one that pushed this possible truce over the line?
I think it is down to a configuration of circumstances. I think that Israel's military efforts in Gaza have stalled. They're not actually dealing a much heavier blow to Hamas now than they have months ago. Meanwhile, IDF soldiers are dying or being seriously injured in IED and mine and explosive strikes along their roads and corridors. I think that Netanyahu is nervous about the incoming Trump administration, which on the one hand is likely to be very friendly to Israeli security interests. But on the other hand, everyone knows Trump thinks his Nobel Peace Prize is, his ticket to a Nobel is peace in the Middle East. Saudi normalization is still on the table. I just think that a lot of things are in place now for something to change. And there's a lot of pressure now being established on Netanyahu that might not have been in place earlier for him to actually finally agree to a deal.
Right. There's still lots of points to consider. And that's why another round of talks is planned in Doha today to finalize remaining details. Could you specify what risks remain that could scupper this deal as a whole?
Certainly. Well, as you're probably already aware, or as viewers may already be aware, there are two facets to the deal. One is a release of hostages in exchange for a release of prisoners, and the other is release of hostages in exchange for a cessation, permanent end to Israel's military actions. And the sticking point has never been the prisoners. It has always been an end to the military action. The concern for Hamas has been that with these phased deals, that Israel will agree to the first phase, but then at some point it will sort of pull out of the deal once it's gotten some of the hostages back and resume fighting. And from the Israeli perspective, they've been very reluctant to agree to a full cessation of hostilities because this still leaves Hamas and the threat it poses intact. So somehow these two sides have got to agree to a more permanent ceasefire than just a phase. And so the new talks have a mechanism that's supposed to support this. It is that talks for the more permanent second phase don't begin until just over 2 weeks in. And hopefully that prevents things from falling through after a monumental effort.
But let's talk about the immediate improvement we could see for the people in Gaza once the truce kicks in. Will food, aid, shelter flow via safe corridors? And what remaining military presence do you foresee?
Israel would remain in Gaza, but it would begin to withdraw in certain areas, and it would, most importantly, permit the passage of all of these internally displaced residents currently in the south. It would permit them to begin to return to what remains of their home in the north. And the north of Gaza has been quite isolated. Humanitarian aid has not reached people still remaining there who are in very serious risk of something like famine or death from illness or inadequate sanitary conditions. So residents would begin to return and aid would begin to flow. And this is a pretty big concession from Israel because, of course, as displaced individuals move from the south to the north, amongst them will likely be Hamas fighters or potential enemies. So for Israel to agree to this is a significant concession, but it's one that has to occur if the residents of Gaza are to return to their lives and begin rebuilding.
So preconditions must be kept in order for this truce to be upheld. But will this ceasefire actually hold is the million-dollar question.
This is not something that anyone can predict. There is an enormous risk that hostilities would resume. A lot of this risk lies on the Israeli side. Netanyahu is widely believed to be prolonging the war in order to secure his political future, because should he agree to a permanent ceasefire, his far-right coalition partners would withdraw from his governing coalition and force an election. And also, as Netanyahu is currently facing a corruption trial, he may be looking at a permanent end to his political career should he end the war now and allow the Israeli public to turn their attentions to that trial and to the process of accountability that must take place for the Israeli political figures responsible for the catastrophe of the war itself. On the other hand, there is always the possibility that Hamas would pull out of its deal, that it would not actually be able to locate its hostages, that it would not be able to credibly follow through its political commitments.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the risks, and it's hard to predict whether these risks will lead to another, another catastrophe. But I would say the most that we can do is be optimistic and hope that everybody comes to the table and recognizes that a lot of innocent lives depend on continued cooperation.
And very briefly, Dr. Pratt, how will Trump 2.0 affect Netanyahu's decision and what will be happening, though it's very hard to expect? How will this affect what will be happening in Gaza?
Trump is a volatile figure. And while he is sympathetic to Israel's security risks, perhaps out of a broader sense that the other inhabitants of the Middle East outside of the borders of Israel are a threat to civilization, I think that it's very difficult to predict what he would do. On the one hand, he seems friendly and he's got close relationships with strong pro-Israel interests on the right. On the other hand, many in his administration are hostile to Israel and perhaps even hostile to Jews more broadly. It's hard to say. So I think that there are both great opportunities and great risks for Netanyahu. That would be his perspective, I imagine. It's hard to predict what Trump would do, but the stakes are high because business is not as usual once Trump takes the reins.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much. That was Simon Frankel Pratt, Senior Lecturer of Political Science at the University of Melbourne, joining us live.